The rain started before sunset on October 24th, 1942. By nightfall, it had thickened into the kind of tropical downpour that turns packed earth to grease and reduces a man's world to the 4 feet of ground he can see. On the southern perimeter of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Burwell Puller was walking his line. He was not walking it the way a commander walks a line he expects to hold without difficulty. He was walking it in the way a man moves when the calculations have already been run and the results have not come out in his favor. Puller had been a Marine for 23 years. He had fought bandits in Haiti and guerrillas in Nicaragua and had spent enough nights listening to jungle to understand the difference between noise and intention. What his listening posts were reporting on the evening of October 24th was intention. Large bodies of men, moving from the south. His battalion, the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, held approximately 1.5 miles of jungle perimeter on the south and southeast edge of the Henderson Field defensive zone. 700 men in rifle pits and fighting holes, behind 2 strands of concertina wire that in some places ran no more than 50 yards in front of their positions. To Puller's right, another Marine battalion. To his left, the Lunga River, and beyond it a gap. A section of line the division had not yet filled because the division did not have enough men to fill it. Puller had reported the gap to the regimental commander. He had reported it twice. The answer both times was that no additional troops were available. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. Puller moved his automatic weapons to cover the open flank as best he could. He shifted his reserve, a thin collection of men roughly equivalent to a rifle platoon, to a position closer to the Lunga approach. Then he went back to walking his line. The Marines in those positions had been on the island since August. They had been eating 2 meals a day since September. Malaria had moved through the battalion with the patience of something that does not need to hurry, leaving men shaking with fever in fighting holes they could not vacate because there was no one to replace them. The medical officer's sick reports, preserved in fragments of the 1st Marine Division War Diary, document rates of fever and dysentery that in any other operational context would have constituted a medical emergency requiring evacuation. On Guadalcanal in October 1942, they constituted the baseline condition of the battalion. Several men had lost 30 pounds or more. Boots had rotted off feet. The skin infections that accompany sustained exposure to equatorial rain and mud had become so universal that the corpsmen had largely stopped treating them individually and were instead providing general guidance on how to manage the deterioration. This was the force that would hold the southern perimeter of Henderson Field. And to understand what they were about to face, you have to understand what was moving toward them through the jungle. The Japanese force that had been cutting its way toward Puller's position was not a raiding party or a reinforced patrol. It was the Sendai Division, formerly the 2nd Infantry Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, a formation with combat records stretching from the Manchurian campaigns of the 1930s through the early Pacific Offensive. Its commander, Lieutenant General Masao Murayama, had been given explicit orders from Imperial General Headquarters to destroy the American defenses at Henderson Field. The logic was straightforward and strategically sound. If the airfield fell, American land-based air power over the southern Solomons collapsed with it. If that air power collapsed, Japan could reinforce and resupply Guadalcanal by sea without the constant attrition losses that had been bleeding the combined fleet's escort strength since August. The island campaign would tip, possibly decisively. Murayama had planned the assault for October 22nd. The jungle had its own opinion. The approach route, a trail cut by Japanese engineers through more than 15 miles of terrain that the maps had not adequately represented, consumed the division's schedule and then its physical condition. Men fell out along the route with heat exhaustion and foot injuries severe enough to require carryout. The heavy field artillery that had been assigned to support the assault had to be abandoned along the trail when it became impossible to move. By the time Murayama's force finally assembled for the attack on October 24th, they had been marching for days on reduced rations through terrain that had taken more out of them than any planning document had anticipated. They were going into the assault without their organic artillery. They were going tired, and they were going in any way because the orders from Tokyo did not contain a provision for postponement due to geography. Puller did not know the precise state of the force moving toward him. What he knew was what his listening posts reported: large movement, multiple approaches coordinated. And he knew it from his own experience in Nicaragua, an experience that the official record in Burke Davis's authorized biography of Puller document in enough detail to understand its formative weight, that the moment a Japanese unit committed to a night assault was not the moment to be reorganizing your defenses. That moment had to have already passed. He had spent the preceding days doing exactly that. The fire plan for artillery support had been worked through in detail with the liaison officer from the 11th Marines, the division's artillery regiment, whose guns were registered on the approaches to his position. Puller had walked the forward edge of his line with the artillery officer and identified the target reference points, not from a theoretical understanding of the terrain, but from personal familiarity with it. The close fire coordinates that would be called during the night, some of them within 100 yards of Marine fighting holes, had been plotted in advance because plotting them in advance was the only way to ensure they could be called accurately in the dark, in the rain, under fire, by men who might not be the men who had originally registered them. At 11:45 in the evening, the first Japanese waves made contact with the wire in front of Puller's center. The Marines opened fire. The 11th Marines opened fire. The first wave came apart in the wire, in the perimeter illumination, in the converging fields of fire that Puller's repositioning of his automatic weapons over the preceding weeks had created. The second wave came 20 minutes later. It was destroyed by the same combination of methods. The men holding the center of Puller's line had by this point been awake for 18 hours and were fighting in a tropical rainstorm in positions that were ankle-deep in water. They fired until their barrels overheated, and then they continued to fire. Along the left flank, attached to Puller's battalion, Sergeant John Basilone commanded a section of heavy machine guns covering a critical approach corridor along the Lunga perimeter. The guns jammed. Basilone cleared them by hand under direct fire, burning his hands on the barrels, and kept them firing. The details of what he did that night are recorded verbatim in his Medal of Honor citation, the only document that needs to be consulted to understand both his individual conduct and the scale of the force pressing against his position. He was recommended for the citation by Puller himself. The center held. The waves broke against it through the first hours past midnight, and each time they broke, the bodies accumulated in front of the wire in numbers that Puller's men could not see in the dark, but could hear. The specific silence that follows concentrated violence before the jungle begins to reclaim its own sound. What Puller did not yet know, at 1:30 in the morning of October 25th, was that the center was not where the crisis was coming from. The main Japanese effort, as Murayama had planned it, was a pincer, 2 assault columns designed to strike both flanks of the American perimeter simultaneously. The eastern column had become disoriented during the approach march through the jungle and struck the wrong sector, hitting a position held by soldiers of the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment at the wrong time and with its coordination broken. It achieved nothing decisive. The western column, aimed directly at the gap on Puller's left flank near the Lunga River, was on time. At approximately 2 in the morning, elements of the Sendai Division pushed through the gap and into Puller's left rear. The message reached Puller's command post within minutes. Puller did not ask for confirmation of the report. He had planned for this. The reserve he had repositioned the previous evening near the Lunga approach, the thin platoon equivalent he had pulled from his already stretched line, was the instrument he had available, and he committed it immediately to block the penetration before it could widen. He then got on a radio to regiment and reported his situation in plain terms. A breakthrough on the left flank, the gap through which the Japanese had entered, and his current disposable strength, which was now effectively nothing. He requested reinforcement. What came back was the 164th Infantry, Army soldiers, fed into Puller's line beginning around 3 in the morning in a process that the regimental war diary describes as occurring squad by squad, with individual Army units physically integrated into Marine positions along the line rather than committed as a unified formation. It was not doctrinally clean. It worked. The men holding the line that night were not, by any clinical definition, in condition to hold it. Fever rates in the battalion would be formally assessed after the engagement, at figures the 1st Marine Division medical officer later characterized in his report as representing nearly half the effective strength. Several of the Marines in fighting positions along the perimeter had temperatures above 101 degrees when the Japanese waves made contact with the wire. The rifles were operating in conditions, sustained tropical rain, fouled actions, sand and debris from the fighting positions, that any ordnance manual would have identified as requiring maintenance before further use. There was no maintenance interval available. There was only the next wave. The communication system that connected Puller's command post to his forward positions was field telephone wire. 8 handsets run through the jungle on reels of WD. One line that had been laid by hand over the preceding weeks. Tropical conditions are hostile to field wire in ways that peacetime training does not fully prepare a signal section for. The insulation degrades. The terminations corrode. Joints made in the rain do not hold the way joints made in a dry wire room hold. By midnight, 2 of the lateral lines connecting Puller's flanks to the command post had gone down. The runners who replaced them, men moving through the same jungle in which the Japanese penetration was developing, carrying messages by hand, were doing work that receives no entry in the regimental citation record, and that was as consequential as anything happening at the wire. Information in a night defensive action is not a supplement to the fighting. It is the fighting. Without a commander's ability to understand where the weight of the assault is falling, the adjustments that hold a line cannot be made. Puller was making those adjustments on the basis of reports that arrived by runner, by surviving telephone, and in at least 2 documented instances by the sound of the firing itself, the direction and density of automatic weapons fire that told an experienced ear where the weight was and where it was shifting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What held the line, beyond the physical courage of individual men, was Puller's fire plan. The artillery support from the 11th Marines fired throughout the night on the pre-registered coordinates Puller had walked and plotted in the preceding days. In the darkness and the rain, with the front shifting and the left flank penetrated, the pre-registration was not a convenience. It was the mechanism by which the defense functioned. Forward observers adjusting fire in those conditions, without pre-established reference points, would have required minutes they did not have. The coordinates Puller had insisted on plotting in daylight, over the objections of a schedule that had competing demands on the artillery regiment's planning time, contracted that adjustment window to seconds. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds in support of the 1st Battalion's perimeter during the course of the night. Roughly a quarter of that volume fell within 200 yards of Marine positions. None of it fell on Marine positions. Along the left flank, attached to Puller's battalion, Sergeant John Basilone commanded a section of heavy machine guns covering a critical approach corridor along the Lunga perimeter. The guns jammed. Basilone cleared them by hand under direct fire, burning his hands on the barrels, and kept them firing. The details of what he did that night are recorded verbatim in his Medal of Honor citation, the only document that needs to be consulted to understand both his individual conduct and the scale of the force pressing against his position. He was recommended for the citation by Puller himself. What the citation does not capture, because no citation is designed to capture it, is the logistical fact that Basilone and his crew had been feeding ammunition to those guns for hours before the jam occurred. The ammunition they consumed that night, belt after belt of .30 caliber, carried forward under fire from a supply point that the runners were servicing continuously, was the product of a resupply arrangement Puller had negotiated with the battalion logistics officer before dark. The guns had ammunition because someone had thought about the guns having ammunition before the guns needed it. That calculation does not appear on any medal. By 4 in the morning, the penetration on the left had been contained. Not cleared, contained. Japanese soldiers remained inside the American perimeter, in the jungle between Puller's reorganized line and the rear positions, and would continue to be a problem through the daylight hours. But the drive had stopped. The western column of the Sendai Division, the main effort of Murayama's assault, had spent itself against the reoriented left flank, and the blocking force Puller had repositioned the night before. The waves that followed, And they did follow, through 3 in the morning and past 4. The last assault elements, making contact with the wire as the rain began to thin toward dawn, found a line that was thinner than any regimental table of organization would have permitted, and that held anyway. Dawn on October 25th came gray and wet and smelling of cordite and mud. Puller walked his line again. What he found in front of the wire would be counted formally in the days that followed. The Guadalcanal campaign records and subsequent historical analyses, including the account assembled by John Lundstrom and the operational documentation preserved in the Marine Corps Historical Division, established total Japanese casualties in the 2-night assault on Henderson Field's southern perimeter at between 900 and 1,100 dead in front of the Marine and Army positions. The precise figure remains a range because the bodies in some forward areas could not be recovered and counted without exposing working parties to sniper fire from the jungle fringe. The estimate in the 1st Marine Division's after-action summary, filed with Fleet Marine Force Pacific, uses the conservative figure. It is still, by any measure, one of the most complete defensive successes against a coordinated night assault in the Pacific Campaign record. Puller filed his own after-action report through the chain of command. It was specific and operational in tone, a document concerned with ammunition expenditures, casualty figures, the gap on the left flank that he had reported twice before the assault and which he reported again in the aftermath, and the performance of the integrated Army-Marine positioning that had developed improvisationally during the night. The report does not contain the phrase that would be attributed to Puller in the years following the war. The suggestion that being surrounded simply meant he could attack in any direction. That formulation entered the record through oral accounts and secondary sources. The written after-action document is a materially different kind of text, a careful inventory of what had been consumed, what it held, and what needed to be addressed before the next engagement. The gap on the left flank was addressed. It was addressed because Puller had put in writing twice before the assault and once after it, and the paperwork created a record that the regimental and division commanders could not subsequently characterize as unforeseen. What happened to Murayama's division is worth understanding in some detail, because the Japanese after-action accounting reveals the assumptions that destroyed it more clearly than any American source can. The Sendai Division had been given an operational plan premised on several beliefs. The first was that the trail cut through the jungle south of Henderson Field was trafficable by heavy weapons. It was not. The artillery that Murayama needed for the assault, the weapons that would suppress the American perimeter and allow his infantry to close through the wire, was abandoned along the approach route because the terrain consumed the time and the labor that would have been required to move it forward. The division went into the assault. It had marched 15 miles to execute without the fire support that the plan required to work. The second belief was that the American defensive line was thinly held and could be penetrated with the infantry mass available. This was partially correct in a way that made it more dangerous than being entirely wrong. The line was thinly held, but thin and inadequately prepared are not the same thing, and the distinction, which Murayama's intelligence picture had not registered, was precisely the work Puller had done in the weeks before the assault. The concertina wire, the repositioned automatic weapons, the pre-registered artillery coordinates, the blocking force moved to cover the gap. Each of these was a choice made against a schedule and a resource constraint, in the way that defensive preparation is always made, incompletely, under pressure, with the knowledge that what you have built will be tested before it is finished. Murayama's intelligence had assessed the American line. It had not assessed the preparation behind it. The third belief, embedded in the operational concept of the entire Guadalcanal campaign by this phase of the fighting, was that American infantry would not hold under sustained night assault. This was not an irrational conclusion from the evidence available to Japanese planners in the summer and fall of 1942. The early weeks on the island had produced engagements in which Marine positions had bent under pressure, in which the weight of coordinated assault had forced local withdrawals and line adjustments. What the Japanese operational calculus had not adequately accounted for was the difference between an assault on an unprepared position and an assault on a prepared one, and the difference between a garrison that had been on the island for 3 weeks and one that had been there for 3 months. The Marines in front of Puller's wire on the night of October 24th had, by that point, fought at the Ilu River at the Matanacaw, in the skies above Sea Lark Channel, and in the jungle between all of those places. They were sick and underweight and operating on inadequate rations. They were also, by October, veterans of a kind that no amount of pre-war training could have produced. They had learned the specific skills of fighting in that specific place, and those skills were not visible in the intelligence photograph or the map overlay. The Sendai Division lost between a third and a half of its effective combat strength over the 2 nights of assaults on the Henderson Field perimeter, not only against Puller's position, but including the failures of the Eastern Column and the subsidiary attacks along other sectors. The division was not destroyed as a formation, but it was effectively finished as an offensive instrument. Maruyama sent a signal to General Hayakitake, commander of the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, reporting the failure. Hayakitake forwarded the assessment to Tokyo. The language in the Japanese operational records for this period, as analyzed by historians, including Frank and the translations preserved in the post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey Naval Interrogation Series, describes the Southern assault as having encountered resistance that exceeded the operational estimate. The phrase is bureaucratic. What it means is that the division had walked 15 miles through jungle, abandoned its artillery, and killed itself against a line that had been prepared by a man who had spent 3 months walking it. Maruyama's own account of the failure, provided in post-war Japanese Army historical records, dwells at length on the terrain. The jungle, the rain, the trail, the weight of the equipment. These are the recurring subjects of his explanation. They are not wrong as explanations. The terrain did consume his schedule, his artillery, and a measurable portion of his men's physical capacity before a single shot was fired on the American perimeter. But the terrain is also a fixed condition. It was the same jungle for both sides. What Maruyama's accounting does not address is the question of what would have happened if the defensive preparation on the other side of that jungle had been of a different quality. If the gap had not been covered. If the artillery coordinates had not been pre-registered. If the reserve had been positioned at the center of the line rather than at the threatened flank. The terrain destroyed his timetable. The preparation destroyed his assault. Puller was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the night of October 24th through 25th. It was his 4th Navy Cross. He would receive a 5th later in the war, making him the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps by that measure. A distinction he held at his death in 1971, and that remains unmatched. The citations, when read in sequence, describe a career defined by the same pattern. Undermanned positions, inadequate resources, detailed preparation in advance of contact, and the decision to hold. What the citations do not describe, because citations are not designed to describe institutional context, is the full picture of what holding cost. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, lost more than 70 men killed and wounded on the night of October 24th. The survivors were not rotated off the island after the engagement. There was no rotation system. They went back to their positions, and they continued to hold them, sick and exhausted, until the division was finally relieved in December. Several men who had fired their rifles through the night of October 24th and 25th would die of malaria in the weeks that followed, in aid stations that were struggling to manage a disease burden the medical supply chain had not been built to handle at that scale. The gap on the left flank, the gap Puller had reported twice before the assault, appears in the regimental after-action documentation as a lesson learned. The language of that category of military record is specific. It identifies something that was not done correctly, proposes corrective action, and moves forward. The men who have been left to cover it with 2 machine guns and a repositioned reserve are not named. The conversation between Puller and the regimental commander about what additional troops were available has not survived in any document that is publicly accessible. What has survived is the outcome. The gap was covered by the preparation of the man responsible for the sector adjacent to it, and the assault did not get through in a way that could not be contained. Henderson Field held. The airfield that both sides understood to be the operational center of gravity for the entire Guadalcanal campaign remained in American hands. The aircraft based there, the fighter and dive bomber strength of the Cactus Air Force, flying from a Piers steel plank runway that the ground crews repaired in the hours between Japanese naval bombardments, continued to contest the sea lanes above the slot. The Tokyo Express continued to run at night, but it ran at cost, and the cost was compounding. By February of 1943, the Japanese High Command had made the decision that would be concealed from the Japanese public for months afterward: the evacuation of Guadalcanal. 11,000 surviving soldiers were taken off the island in 3 nights of disciplined, largely undetected withdrawal. The campaign was over. The single sentence that the Japanese Army's official history of the Guadalcanal campaign devotes to the failure of the Southern assault does not name Puller or the 1st Battalion. It describes the assault as having failed to achieve its objective due to conditions encountered during the approach march and resistance at the objective that exceeded the operational estimate. It does not address the gap that was covered before the assault made contact with it. It does not address the artillery coordinates that were registered in daylight and called in the dark. It does not address the reserve that was repositioned the evening before the assault to cover an approach that had been identified as a threat and left unresolved by the chain of command above battalion level. Military history tends to name the battles. It is slower to name the preparation. The engagement on the night of October 24th through 25th, 1942, is recorded in the campaign literature under various headings: the Battle for Henderson Field, the Second Matanikau action in its broader context, the night Puller held the line. What it was underneath all of those framings was the result of a man walking the same 1.5 miles of jungle perimeter for 3 months, in the rain, in the dark, asking questions about what was not yet covered, and then finding ways to cover it with what he had. That work has no citation. It has no date. It was done in the ordinary time before the assault, in the hours that are never dramatic and are always decisive. On the morning of October 25th, 1942, Puller requested additional barbed wire. He had expended most of what he had in front of the positions that held through the night, and he expected the Japanese to try again. The request is recorded in the 1st Marine Division supply records. The wire was delivered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.